Godzilla is so big and has such a lengthy legacy, I'm not even going to try to explain it or condense it. You know Godzilla. Even if you haven't seen a single Godzilla film, you know him. The lovable and destructive, big lizard monster. I've always been entranced by Godzilla since I was very young, but despite my friends being quite excited about the American version released in 2014 when I was like 9 or 10 or something, I never ended up seeing that movie. My first Godzilla movie ended up coming much later when I watched Shin Godzilla as a teenager. I'd already watched things like Evangelion and respected Hideki Anno as an artist, so when the film that was directed by him was considered one of the best Godzilla works, that was an easy entry point for me. And oh my god, I absolutely loved it. I still treasure that movie to this day as one of my favorites. But I felt the need to do my due diligence. Of course, I'd heard things about the original film. It's an interesting allegory, the writing, all of that. So finally, this year, after getting the urge to see my big scaly friend again, I watched the first Godzilla movie. I watched a couple of Godzilla movies, really. Some of the original Japanese ones, some of the American ones. It got me interested in the veritable menagerie of big monsters that have terrorized and delighted the silver screen over the years. The Kaiju movie has such a long and legendary history, one that I think a lot of people don't even know about. And with so many movies by so many creators throughout decades and decades of film, it's a never-ending buffet. So I decided to chart a course. I'm going to watch as many Kaiju movies as I can get my hands on. Which, with the internet as it is basically all of them. I will cover each movie in a video as I go along. This is my new show, Kaiju Classics. There are no hard rules on what defines a Kaiju movie. I plan on starting with the large wave Godzilla caused back in its day, but I don't mind jumping back and forth through history to cover what I please. As I talk about each movie, I'm going to give a brief history of its development, I'm going to review it, then rank it against every other movie I've reviewed as part of this long-running Kaiju series. So with a ridiculous amount of movies to go over, and a sheer excitement to experience all of the cinema, it felt only right to start with The Poster Child. Absolutely not the first kaiju or monster movie ever produced, but certainly the one that has left the biggest mark on the world since. Which of course is the original Godzilla. Alongside that, however, we are going to discuss its basically forgotten sequel, Godzilla Raids Again. I could not be more excited about this project, which I plan on chipping away at for years to come. So without further ado, let's get started with the history behind the 1954 classic, Godzilla, directed by Ishiro Honda. So, of course the history behind this first and legendary film is one of the most interesting. It all starts with Toho, a film company in Japan. The production and distribution company was first formed in 1932, but we could skip all the way to February 1954. Producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was on a flight back to Japan from Indonesia. Of course, then it was known as the Dutch East Indies. A film called In the Shadow of Glory was being developed between Japan and Indonesia, but had fallen through. It's not entirely confirmed why, but the most agreed upon reason is due to pressures from the Indonesian people who were not happy about the Japanese occupation at the time. The producer was on a flight back after negotiations went poorly, and as he was in the plane, he started to think about monster movies. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms had been released the previous year and was a massive success. The year before that, a theatrical re-release of 1933's King Kong had done better than any other previous runs. The money and excitement was there for a monster movie. Combining that with a recent incident of a fishing boat being hit with radiation from the United States nuclear tests in Bikini Atoll. In fact, he was flying over Bikini Atoll at the time, which is what got his mind thinking. Before he even landed, he wrote out the outline for a film called The Giant Monster from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Not the most unique title just yet. He gave the pitch to executive producer Iwao Mori, and the previous crew and director Senkichi Taniguchi from In the Shadow of Glory were going to take the project, but he didn't want to at all. Science fiction wasn't the most respected genre, so while the movie idea was potentially lucrative, it was not all that prestigious. It took a couple of turned-down offers, though the exact amount is very unclear, before the production company arrived at Ishiro Honda. Ishiro Honda had been working as a co-director for Akira Kurosawa years before, who was a prolific Japanese filmmaker at the time. He still remains, perhaps, the most famous and critically beloved in Japanese cinema. Ishiro Honda, on the other hand, was wholeheartedly dedicated to the material. He was deeply interested in the concept. Honda was quoted later as saying, "If our hearts were not in it 100%, it would not have worked." And he was. He'd worked with a special effects artist, Eiji Tsuburaya, before, who was up to the task for the big lizard. Interestingly though, Godzilla wasn't always intended to be a big lizard. First drafts of the character had him looking a lot more like King Kong that served as his inspiration. Even his Japanese name, Gojira, originally pulled from the word gorilla for gorilla, as well as the word for whale, which is Kujira. Gorilla, Kujira, Gojira. However, eventually they did settle on the more reptilian design we know and love now. Tsuburaya had wanted to film the monster in stop motion, akin to that original King Kong film, but eventually gave in when projections appeared ironically monstrous for both time and budget. He estimated a 7-year production window, which was just ludicrous. In the end, the film ended up being filmed for 51 days, then with an additional 71 days for special effects photography. A majority of the special effects were done with what was dubbed suitmation, and extensive miniature work. As for the suit itself, 2 men played the titular monster, Haruo Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka. Nakajima went on to continue to play Godzilla all the way up to Godzilla vs. Gigan in 1972. Filming in the suit was apparently terrible. The inelastic material was incredibly difficult to move in, and the heat was unbelievable. They poked holes in the neck which barely provided any breathing. The original form of the suit was too thick and strong, so it was cut in half and used separately for filming, but even in the newer thin suit, Nakajima couldn't last for longer than 3 minutes without collapsing. Unfortunately, Tezuka struggled even more in the suit, and nearly none of his shots ended up in the final cut. Now, to be fully honest, I could keep going on about the history forever. About Ishiro Honda, about the miniatures and Eiji Tsuburaya, but I do want to keep this a slightly reasonable length. Another large omission will be the eventual American re-release and the changes therein. I want to focus on the originals of all of these movies, so any American versions will be mostly ignored. Just know there's a lot more to this. In the description, I've got a podcast I really liked listening to as I went through all of this, as well as a book I used for a lot of my info. Both are worth giving a look. So, with all of that production history in mind, and knowing that we're only scratching the surface with it, we can move on to the actual film, Godzilla. Now, for this discussion, we're going to go through the plot pretty closely. When discussing other movies in the series, I'm going to be a lot briefer in general with my recaps. I thought, as the very foundation of the series though, and since it's a rather dense movie all things considered, it's worth taking our time here just this once, so bear with me. The opening of the film is a pretty direct reference to the nuclear boating incident that inspired it. Then after, we see a very short scene of a young couple's date being interrupted when the man is called upon his work. These will be our pseudo-protagonists, though they are quite sparingly seen throughout the whole film considering that role. The woman is Emiko, and the man is Ogata. As the Coast Guard attempts to investigate this weird issue of the fishing boat, they lose ship after ship. We start to follow some islanders after a survivor from one of the other ships rocks up there. Their fishing spoils are turning up empty, and an old man blames it on the mythical legend Godzilla, though he's quickly dismissed. A storm hits the island, and we watch with brutal horror as it decimates the people, the buildings, and visiting reporters' helicopters. But something appears to be obscured by the strong winds, and a weird screech can be heard, only seen in the tiniest glimpses and horrified reactions. We then cut to a scientific seminar attempting to reconcile everything so far. We hear a few testimonies before culminating in one Dr. Yamane, who recommends a proper investigation into the island's decimation. We find the young couple once again sent on said investigation, who remark on Dr. Serizawa actually leaving his lab to bid them farewell. On the island, they find some odd radioactive readings they struggle to explain. Then they find a footprint. alongside a small piece of rubble that ends up actually being a long extinct creature still mostly intact. It becomes clearer and clearer that something ancient and something dangerously radioactive did all of this. Suddenly they are called to the other side of the island as someone saw something. So now we finally see him. Godzilla. Godzilla peeks over the hill in all of his horrible glory. While we can't get a good look at the whole of him right now, I think it's a good time to take a break and discuss his design. It's pretty great. I think an aspect to it that gets lost in a lot of modern renditions is just how kind of ugly he is. This is not a cool, sleek dinosaur. Instead it looks malformed and even like derpy at times. Its bulbous face and protruding eyes so clearly communicate that this is a creature that has been disfigured by radiation. It's a really impactful part of his look that ties the whole thing together. All in all, there isn't like too much to him besides that. He's got that scaly lizard-like look, sort of mixing in the small arms of that classic idea of a T-Rex. It isn't too ambitious in the face of things yet to come, but on its own, and this early, it is striking, and it more than does the job. And finally, maybe the most iconic aspect to this monster is its roar. It has practically become a soundbite that everyone has heard of by this point, regardless of if they've seen the original movie or not. It is such an intense and shrieking roar, with this odd depth to it that sounds inhuman. It isn't just a generic dinosaur scream or animal sound, it has this resonance. It also has some interesting history to it. The director Honda was the first to decide that Godzilla must roar, and while the two men tasked with sound recording and effects were initially given the job, it was actually the composer Akira Ifukube that stepped in to make it. He went and recorded a bunch of animal sounds and played them at different speeds, but none of them were really working. Eventually, the way he got the actual roar as we hear it began with a double bass. He loosened the strings, took a glove, and coated it with pine resin. Then he grabbed the strings and ran the glove down them to create that horrifying sound. After a bit of editing, it ended up the noise we know and love today. Interesting stuff. Overall, it makes sense that this monster stood the test of time, and we will be treated to many, many redesigns to analyze and enjoy later down the line. For now, let's just continue. So, after concluding the obvious, that this is some prehistoric creature stirred on by nuclear testing, the government resolves to kill the beast before it can do any more damage. Depth charges are deployed, but to no effect. Dr. Yamane opposes this, as we see in his house. His daughter is actually that woman from the couple we've occasionally met, Emiko, throughout the film. The country discusses and discourses over what to do with Godzilla. Yamane says the monster is outright unkillable, and research should be done rather than destruction. We also discover that Dr. Serizawa is Emiko's fiancé, and the couple we're followed are actually dating behind his back. A reporter reaches out to her since Serizawa denied any interview, hoping that she could escort him, which she does. She has the aim to also confess about her love for Ogata during this meeting. They arrive to find Serizawa is very guarded about his research. The reporter leaves without having gained anything, leaving the supposedly engaged couple alone. Serizawa chooses to finally show off his work to someone, and he picks the woman he trusts to do so. He brings her down to his lab and explains that he's been inventing something terrible. They don't really get into it here yet, so I'll withhold it too. We just see a tank of fish dying horribly. I really hope the fish on set were fine though, but I'm not sure, as there weren't that rigorous of standards back then. Serizawa promises her to say nothing of what he showed her. After she returns home, Emiko is too shaken by what she saw to say much, but her melancholy is interrupted by an imminent attack on the shoreline by Godzilla. We're treated to the first scene of destruction before he retreats back into the water. As the government desperately plans, they evacuate all coastal zones of Tokyo area and establish a better military defense. Godzilla attacks again, and this time we see a lot of it in horrible detail. We'll cover what I think of these scenes in a moment. Eventually, Godzilla retreats back to the ocean, annoyed by the missile fire, but not all that much affected by it. Horrified by everything that's happened, Emiko cannot keep Serizawa's research secret and tells Ogata everything. Serizawa has developed a bomb even more destructive than the H-bombs that wrecked Japan years earlier, the Oxygen Destroyer. He did so for sheer research's sake, but he can't ethically permit even the very knowledge of this invention escaping, for he knows it will be only used in the most horrible of ways. But Emiko realizes this could be the very thing to defeat Godzilla. The couple goes to confront Serizawa and ask him for his help. He absolutely wants no part in it, fearing the worst and for good reason. As the three argue for a while, all desperate for some sort of resolution or hope, a broadcast plays on the TV, one that shows the ways the country is suffering from Godzilla's attacks and trying its best to hold itself together. Serizawa arrives at a conclusion. He will use his weapon to defeat Godzilla. He begins by burning his notes, leaving all of the information in his head. Then, when at sea, he takes a diving suit and determines to activate the bomb underwater himself. Ogata decides to accompany him down below. As he does so, Serizawa cuts off his air supply, killing himself and burying the secrets of the oxygen destroyer with him. We watch as Godzilla dies agonizingly in the water. People celebrate, and Dr. Yamane solemnly speculates that if nuclear testing continues, there will be another Godzilla in the future. Well, there we go. Sorry if that got a little exhaustive, but I thought it was important. This movie offers a lot to think about, and it's difficult to speak about even the slightest bits without taking the rest of it into account. But now that we have, we can really get into it. I think the most striking thing about this movie is probably the way the destruction and chaos is filmed. So much care and attention is put into immaculate sets getting horribly ruined, beautiful miniatures getting brutalized and wrecked. Small narrative beats are even used to accentuate the emotions all of this is intended to give. For example, a quick shot of a family holding onto each other as the mother tells her children they'll be joining their father in the afterlife soon, before we cut away to the broken building they were in. It's all done with such razor-sharp precision to display the horror of destruction. I don't need to eulogize just how impactful this would have been not long after World War II. The desolate burning cityscape shown once Godzilla leaves says it all itself, really. For a while, Japan had not been allowed to showcase the nuclear bombs in artistic pieces by the Americans during the occupation. Art was placed under rigorous scrutinization to ensure that nothing controversial would get through. Of course, it wasn't holistic, nor did it catch everything, but it had a large impact on culture until they left in the early 50s. So this sort of thing had only been allowed to be in Japanese cinema for a very short time, adding to the shock and intensity of it. But even then, it is harrowing no matter who you are or when you watch this film. They even started out like this just to force you into these feelings. Mere minutes in after the boat scene, we're placed in a chaotic setting where the families of the victims are desperately begging for any news about their loved ones. The tension is palpable, the cacophony is dizzying, and the stress is real. It's one everyone has experienced, at least to some extent, desperately hoping someone is alright, but having no way to confirm it. And here it's made so much more brutal since, barely anyone's made it. And realistically, the people there know that too. They're just too confused, angry, and upset to accept it, and for very good reason. All of it adds depth to the characters, without even really including them. You never learn a lot about these people, besides their personal philosophy on how to handle Godzilla. They don't waste time with anecdotes and needless exposition to learn who they are as characters. To some extent, who they are doesn't even matter. They are just all of Japan in many ways. You feel exactly what they feel. You have to sit and marinate in the misery this beast is causing, with seemingly no hope at all to cling to. It feels like the end of the world, and throughout the film you're really forced to confront that. It's quite valuable. I appreciate in general that the film really doesn't have any wasted scenes or time. In the next movie, the summary is dramatically shorter, and not just because I wanted to be brief. Most movies just had some superfluous stuff to fill out the runtime a tad, or just plot elements that aren't as efficient as they could be. That is not always a bad thing. Efficiency isn't the point of art. But I appreciate that Godzilla doesn't concern itself with things that wouldn't really improve the movie much. Instead, it remains at a tight 96-minute runtime without any wasted space. But it never feels rushed or exhaustively quick either. Hits a nice sweet spot instead. Now we have to get to its allegory and themes. Of course, Godzilla represents the bomb. The threat of this sudden destruction with seemingly no answer or solution. Nothing can undo the destruction that takes place, and the possibility of it happening again will almost certainly exist. I actually think inevitability is a large part of the movie's script. The way Serizawa doesn't see the worst uses of his invention as possible, but inevitable. The only possible outcome is that it is used for the worst and harms people on a hellish scale. The last words spoken in the film suggest that Godzilla won't be the last of these disasters if nuclear testing continues. And it did! Bikini Atoll, the place which caused the fisherman incident, the place where the United States forced hundreds of native inhabitants to just leave only to test, the place which the United States actively lied about the range of potential fallout, that all started in 1946, and was even revived in the late 50s, 4 years after the movie came out. But when it stopped, that didn't mean the threat was gone. It meant they were now confident in their weapon and could use it again at any time. Bigger, stronger, and easier to produce than ever. After all, in just 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, where outright nuclear war was on the brink of erupting. All of this can be felt in every one of Godzilla's angry footsteps, the static sound of the Geiger counter when they first go to investigate. It truly is frightening. Serizawa's plight and Dr. Yamane's horror really is the center of the film, struggling to fight what will happen. Serizawa will use the oxygen destroyer, and while he may have delayed development by burning his notes and dying with his research, sheer exposure to the possibility will have governments rushing to research it. Dr. Yamane knows it's a threat that can't be killed. He says this literally in the film, but it applies in a metaphorical way just as strongly. Sure, this Godzilla was killed. But what about the next? The one after that? New tests developing new weapons that could disturb older creatures. Japan can never truly feel safe again. It's a depressing tone, and one that outright ignores subtlety. It's bombastic and open about what it means to say. It is a declaration against the arms race that motivates militaries, and a plea for any sort of pacifism. Honda's history as a war veteran really reverberates throughout the whole thing. It should be clear just how much I like this movie, and how much it does right, but I also think it's a fun exercise to try and squeeze some criticism out of this film. After all, no movie is perfect. I think the most glaring thing to me is the odd romantic subplot. The marriage between Serizawa and Emiko feels sort of forced, because it basically is like no real conclusion. The story would have worked just as well if they were siblings or related or something. I think it is a bit distracting to include something like this that feels both out of place and sort of aimless. You might be thinking about how it's going to continue or resolve during other scenes which deserve your attention more. And since you never find out why they were married in the first place, especially since Serizawa barely seems interested, you never learn anything about Emiko and Ogata's love besides the fact they planned on going for a date at the start. In fact, Ogata as a whole doesn't really do too much, especially when he's almost framed as the protagonist by the film. Personally, I think the reason they did that was because they wanted to give the movie a male lead that wasn't the mysterious Serizawa or the elderly Yamane. But the movie would have been a little bit better without him, to be honest. And I think a greater focus on Emiko could have worked really well, navigating a loveless engagement and her father's existential worries. None of this greatly impacts the film in any negative way, but it's worth looking under a critical lens. I'm not saying these changes would be perfect in their own right, just some ideas I personally had in response to the small issues. But other than that, Godzilla 1954 is a movie that deserves the international praise and recognition it's received. If anything, I'm sad it doesn't have more attention. The only real Blu-ray or 4K releases outside of Japan are both from the Criterion collection. They might do some of the best work out there, but they only work in America and sometimes the UK, leaving us Europeans in the dust! Though, I'll be complaining about that a lot more when we get to the obscure monsters. I think the legacy of the film is slightly too grand to easily wrap up here. In fact, you can kind of see the rest of this series as an attempt to cover the legacy of Godzilla. It's a movie that stands on its own 2 feet, and it's a must-watch for any fans of the film. It's practically a bible for any fans of monsters. But a thing I think is very interesting to end on as we start looking at sequels and future is how people responded to the creature itself. Something that was apparently very surprising to the creators of Godzilla was that test audiences and greater audiences once it came out really empathized with Godzilla. And there's a lot of reasons why. A lot of people may be disheartened with their own country due to a lot of Japanese's war crimes at the time, were definitely struck by the image of Godzilla destroying the Diet building, and the way he acts like not this spectre of hate, but a creature, just beast that doesn't know what it is and just exists to suffer and destroy. The final scene of it agonizingly dying is heart-wrenching, and a lot of people cried more for Godzilla's death than any of the others. It recontextualizes the idea of this character living on in future movies, or at least being recreated in those future movies. Something worth considering as we get to it. Speaking of, the sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, released in 1955. When following up something like Godzilla, I think you sort of have to eulogize the original. The original is a work in and of itself, but the sequel has to make a future out of it. Especially in the face of such a long-running series, I think it's interesting to consider. What about Godzilla lends itself to a sequel? Of course, the answer is basically always money, but what about the aspects that made Godzilla successful? And I do think it was just that. It was the appeal of Godzilla and the way people empathized with Godzilla. And while we're still very far from the eventual turn his character will take into savior of Japan, the seeds of that future can be seen in just how likable he is. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Just this sequel is interesting enough in a couple of ways. It's the last Godzilla movie to be made in black and white, it's the first to feature multiple monsters, which we'll get to later, but it's best to start with the production history. So Godzilla did really well. Mere weeks after the original's release, a party was held for Iwamori, the executive producer. During it, he told Tanaka, the producer and the original brain behind the first movie, to make a new one, a sequel. Ishiro Honda was caught up at the time directing a film called Love Tide, and was unable to work on this movie, so instead Motoyoshi Oda was brought onto the project. It was reported at the time that the decision to not wait was likely due to Mori wanting to keep up with Godzilla's current momentum. The movie was filmed very quickly due to this. In fact, lead actor Hiroshi Koizumi called it a bit rushed, and even the producer Tanaka said that due to the short filming time, it was hard to call the movie a success. To be honest, there isn't too much interesting info to go over. There were some production problems caused by the absolutely horrible to move in suits, some issues with miniatures breaking too easily or not breaking easily enough and the like, but overall the information on development reflects the development itself. It was pretty minor and pretty quick. So I think it's worth jumping straight into the flick. Welcome to Godzilla Raids Again. As I go over the plot summary, I'm going to partially skip over the human drama. This isn't out of lack of interest, but rather, I just don't think narrating the entire plot is worthwhile. Like I said before, I don't want to replace a viewing experience with this video, and I don't want this video to be more summary than analysis. So since I'm recommending these movies as a go, I want to leave something for you to discover if you ever check it out. And not to mention, it'll just bloat the video in a way that I think respects no one's times. So, let's just jump in. The movie starts with some banter between a couple of pilots in the air working for a fishing company. Our main character, Tsukioka, and another man, Kobayashi. Kobayashi experiences some minor engine issues, so has to make an emergency landing. He ends up in an odd little rocky terrain, and Tsukioka is sent to go help him out. However, the two discover something quite grave. A giant monster, Godzilla! But he isn't alone as he battles against another dangerously large creature. The two escape without too much trouble, and we cut to a meeting of government officials and scientists. One of which is Yamane from the previous movie, sporting his depressing 1,000-yard stare. They play a few straight minutes of footage from the original movie to remind everyone who Godzilla is, and they kind of gloss over the appearance of this new one by just saying, "There's another Godzilla!" Of course, the idea was hinted at in the original film, but you would expect a little bit more weight to the idea of his re-emergence. The other beast, however, is quite easily identified as a prehistoric creature called Anguirus, and now is the best time to discuss this monster and its design. Anguirus is quite interesting visually. I like that it looks a lot less malformed than Godzilla, like a more potentially realistic beast. It features numerous thorns on its back and walks around on all fours. As the first opponent to the iconic lizard, it does a good job differentiating itself, despite its lack of crazy abilities or particular spectacle. Overall, I like it. I don't think it will stand up to the quite massive roster once we get a bit further into these movies, but for now I actually do think it serves its purpose here without much issue. But back to the movie, since they're left without the oxygen destroyer, they can only delay the inevitable. By creating a blackout, they can lure Godzilla away from Osaka by using flares, since the monster seems quite sensitive to light. Interestingly, this is a real tactic the Japanese government used at the end of World War II to evade Allied bombing runs. So the appearance of it here only 10 years later would have carried some weight with it. We encounter a few more scenes of the main character and his girlfriend Hidemi, who are both worried about their city and each other. The plan begins in earnest and seems to be working pretty well until a single rogue incident spells the end to the scheme. We're treated to a long scene of prisoners breaking free from their transportation and fleeing the police. Eventually it escalates until the truck they're driving collides with some oil barrels and erupts into a large fire, rendering the blackout useless and once again attracting Godzilla's wrath. They intercept the monster at a bay in Osaka and pelt him with missiles and tank fire as usual. Just as it seems hopeless, Anguirus suddenly bursts out of the water and the two continue to fight. Godzilla finally kills Anguirus and retreats back into the water, the looming threat of him remaining even after the shoreline was thoroughly demolished. Then we are treated to a couple more fairly interesting scenes of our characters at a company dinner, but it is interrupted upon news of Godzilla re-emerging. They trace him to a small frozen island. The final scene shows them battling with the monster until they finally decide to bury him in ice. After some tragic losses and a lot of shots where ships shoot off missiles, they finally succeed and the movie ends. Now, there's a lot to talk about here. While I skipped over the human characters, I actually thought they were quite likable. Clearly they didn't have a lot of time to develop them deeply, but they don't need to be, and what we have is interesting. It endears us to these people and shows us a good point of perspective. It's hard to exactly describe why they feel a little bit more personable to me. I think a large part of it is that there's so much more time for these characters to just talk without any direct stress or threat. Simple, realistic conversations make them a lot more like people you may know in real life. While in the first Godzilla, not much conversation happens about anything besides the looming terror of the monster. I think it works a lot better in the original Godzilla, but since it isn't aiming to achieve the same thing here, it's actually a smart thing to implement. All this comes alongside a decidedly more uplifting tone than the original. I think the destruction of Osaka represents that best. Hidemi's father owns the fishing company mentioned earlier and the factory on the shoreline. But in an interestingly handled scene, he explains that they'll just move to a new location. The losses suffered are notable and won't be forgotten, but life moves on and the world has not ended. It's curious. I don't think it was a good idea in the end, but I appreciate its conclusion. It makes the movie a lot less impactful and less intense, but it gives it its own flavour and perspective on the whole thing. It doesn't feel like they weren't able to emulate the horror of the first, so they decided to go something else. It did feel like a genuine artistic decision, just one with less strength than the original has overall, especially since it isn't achieved in such depth as the original. But I do appreciate that they're trying new things, because the worst part of this movie is when they're just retreading the original in worse ways. Another thing worth covering is the Kaiju battle. As the first actual fight between monsters in the series, it's an interesting spectacle, though a bit underwhelming. It will be a while before we see another movie of monsters fighting properly, so let's cherish it a bit here. The suits don't offer a wide range of movement, so considering that, they are able to appear fairly dynamic. Some notable scenes like Anguirus biting at Godzilla's neck pack a really good punch and left me wincing. But there isn't much of a technical narrative to follow. There's barely any sort of choreography, so you're just watching two people in suits scrape and claw at each other. It's tough to exactly expect a lot more, but it is inherently limiting. For fights like this, I think you always have two options in how you frame it. You can either lean into the spectacle of it, creating a visual sensation that leaves you in awe, or you can make a technical narrative, where you're able to follow each action quite closely and find engagement in the movements themselves and the decisions being made. This doesn't really land on either. However, I do like, again, that you can feel the difference between these two monsters. Of course, Godzilla on his legs and Anguirus on all fours, they have a very different style, and it does actually shine through a bit. Of course, it's over by the halfway point, and to be honest, the final set piece could have done with some action to spruce it up. The ending is a little bit boring, as it is. It ends with 20 minutes of repetitive shots of planes, Godzilla, missiles, and falling snow, but Oh well. It makes sense to have killed off the monster halfway through in some ways, and I think the focus on Godzilla itself is both a pro and a con at the end. You can tell the movie was rushed out, and honestly, it looks a lot cheaper than the original. I couldn't find consistent numbers on the budget though, so it's hard to verify. It definitely starts the trend of endless explosives, tanks, and missiles more than the original did. We will come to see a lot of that in future entries. Overall, its biggest sin is just being a bit boring without saying too much. The drama isn't particularly exciting with the monsters. It definitely feels quite by the book. Ironic considering it was in the process of inventing the Toho Kaiju movie formula. However, while in comparison to the original Godzilla, it may not hold a candle to very many, if any, of its qualities, I did find some of the characters a bit more relatable and human-feeling in this film than that. Dr. Yamane and Serizawa are quite cartoonish in the original, which works well for what it's trying to achieve. But I found a lot more to actually empathize with when it comes to people like Hidemi or Kobayashi. I don't want to exaggerate their qualities, but I found something a little bit more appealing about them and their smaller problems, which are then dwarfed by Godzilla. So while it is by all means a forced cash grab sequel, it's not without its charms. So, here we are at the end of the video, which means it's time to rank the films. At the very end of every episode of Kaiju Classics, I will rate the new additions against the overall pantheon. But first, we need to build it from scratch. So our first entries are the original Godzilla at number 1, and its sequel right below it. Simultaneously the second best and absolute worst so far. I think it goes without saying why I'm ranking it these way. There'll be a lot more to talk about when we actually have some other movies to slide in between, above or below. As for the next episode, I'm going to be covering Rodan from 1956, The Mysterians from 1957, and Varan the Unbelievable in 1958. If you'd like to hear my coverage of any of that, feel free to subscribe. Like I mentioned before, my sources and recommended listening are all listed in the description, so if you're interested, be sure to check that out. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.